My name is Emma Carter, and if you're here listening, don't forget to subscribe, not just to my story, but to my lesson. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't entertainment. It's survival. It's betrayal. And it's revenge. That's how I would begin if this story were a podcast, or a documentary on Wall Street's darkest secrets. But this isn't scripted. This is my life. And every sentence bleeds. I was born in Boston, Massachusetts, in a middle-class family that valued honesty above all else. My father, Richard Carter, was a retired banker, the kind of man who balanced his checkbook every night and still believed a handshake meant something. My mother, Helen, was a schoolteacher who spent more time teaching me the meaning of integrity than algebra. My younger brother, Michael, was a dreamer, tech genius, mischief maker, and my greatest ally. We weren't rich, but we were grounded. My father used to say, "Emma, people can steal your money, your job, even your house. But never let them steal your name." I carried that advice with me when I stepped into New York City for the first time, ready to carve my name into its skyline. That's when I met Daniel Blake. Daniel wasn't just handsome, he was magnetic. He had the kind of smile that disarmed suspicion and the kind of confidence that made you want to follow him into fire. I was 24, fresh out of business school, working at a small brokerage firm, and Daniel seemed like the missing piece of the empire I dreamed of building. He wasn't just my boyfriend, he became my partner, my co-founder, my fiancé. Together, we started a finance startup called Blake & Carter Investments. For 2 years, life felt like a movie. We worked 16-hour days, survived on takeout and cheap coffee, and fantasized about the day our names would be carved into glass towers. Daniel handled investors with his charisma, while I built the backbone, spreadsheets, strategies, research. My family adored him. My father admired his ambition. My mother said he reminded her of movie stars. My brother, Michael, half-jokingly warned me, "He's too smooth, Emma. Sharks smile before they bite." I laughed off his warning. Love makes you blind. Ambition makes you deaf. The betrayal didn't come in one dramatic crash. It came in whispers, missed phone calls, late nights at the office, documents I signed without reading because I trusted him. Then came the morning that rewrote my life. I logged into our firm's accounts, expecting to see steady growth. Instead, I saw zero. Nothing. Our funds had been drained overnight. My personal savings, gone. My investments, gone. Every cent I had poured into the business had vanished. I thought it was a mistake. I thought there was a glitch. But then I found the documents, contracts I had signed in blind trust, transferring power of attorney, giving Daniel authority over funds. And then, the final knife, a photo of Daniel on social media, in the Bahamas, arm around another woman. The caption, "New Beginnings." I can't put into words the silence that followed. It wasn't just financial ruin. It was humiliation. It was betrayal of the deepest kind. I had trusted him with my future, my family's pride, my name. And in one stroke, he took it all. My father's face when I told him, disappointment etched into his eyes, not because of the money, but because I had failed to protect myself. My mother's tears filled our small kitchen in Boston, as if the betrayal was hers too. Michael was the only one who didn't pity me. He looked me straight in the eye and said, "Don't cry, Emma. Rise. You don't end this story as the victim. You end it as the executioner." That sentence lit a fire in me. But rising wasn't simple. Overnight, I went from co-founder of a promising firm to a bankrupt, humiliated woman blacklisted in finance. Daniel made sure of that. He spread rumors, said I was reckless, incompetent, a liability. Investors turned their backs. Friends disappeared. In New York, reputation is currency, and mine was destroyed. For weeks, I drowned in despair. I stayed in my tiny apartment, lights off, blinds shut, replaying every conversation, every kiss, every lie. I thought about ending it all more than once. But every time I looked at my mother's tear-streaked face, my father's silence, and my brother's unwavering faith, something inside me hardened. Emma Carter, the dreamer, the believer, the woman who thought love and numbers could coexist, died in that apartment. What was born in her place was colder, sharper, ruthless. I realized something crucial: money isn't real. It's numbers on a screen, symbols on paper. What's real is power. Power to control those numbers. Power to dictate who eats and who starves, who rises and who falls. Daniel hadn't just stolen my money, he had stolen my power. And if I wanted revenge, I couldn't just take it back. I had to take more. I had to take everything. I remember standing in front of the mirror one night, whispering to myself like a vow. He thinks he ended me. But I'll return. Not as Emma the victim. Not as Emma the fiancée. I'll return as Emma the executioner. And when I do, I'll take not just his money, but his name, his empire, his soul. From that moment, my mission was set. I left New York in silence, erasing every trace of myself. I disappeared into the shadows of finance, Chicago, San Francisco, even London, working low-level jobs where nobody knew my face. By day, I was invisible. By night, I studied the masters of destruction, hedge fund titans, corporate raiders, forensic accountants. I devoured stories of hostile takeovers, bankruptcies, market crashes. I wasn't looking for comfort anymore. I was sharpening my blade. And while I was building in silence, Daniel Blake was climbing. He expanded Blake and Carter Investments into Stonewall Capital, a billion-dollar empire. He strutted across magazine covers, graced Forbes lists, through galas with senators and celebrities. To the world, he was a self-made genius. To me, he was a thief walking in borrowed skin. But here's the thing about thieves, eventually, they leave fingerprints. And I was learning how to trace every single one. So if you're listening, if you're subscribed to this voice, understand this: the wound that started it all wasn't just betrayal. It was rebirth. And the woman who rises from ashes doesn't rise empty-handed. She rises with fire. And Daniel Blake? My darling fiancé, my traitor, my first and last mistake? He doesn't know it yet, but I'm coming back. And when I do, I won't just take revenge. I'll take everything. They say when you fall in New York, the city doesn't stop. It just steps over you. And for a while, I let it. I let myself drown in the humiliation Daniel left me in. But here's the truth: pain is a better teacher than any Ivy League professor. And I was about to get my PhD in revenge. When I left New York, I didn't just pack my bags. I buried Emma Carter, the broken fiancée, in that apartment. I cut ties with everyone who knew me except my family. My father Richard wired me a small sum, his retirement savings, despite my protests. "It's not charity," he said, pressing my hand through the phone. "It's seed money. Plant it wisely." My mother Helen told me to come home, to abandon the world that broke me. But I couldn't. Michael, my brother, was the only one who understood. "Don't run, Em. Hunt. Learn how they move, and then move faster." So I did. Chicago was my first battlefield. I took a junior analyst role at a mid-sized investment firm, working 12-hour days for scraps. Nobody knew who I was, and I intended to keep it that way. By day, I prepared quarterly reports, ran balance sheets, and fetched coffee for men who thought I was invisible. By night, I devoured their discarded notes, studied their strategies, memorized how they manipulated markets. I wasn't chasing salary, I was chasing patterns. Then came San Francisco, where I joined a boutique venture capital firm. Here, I learned how dreams were priced, how startups were gutted, and how Silicon Valley billionaires played poker with human lives. I saw bright-eyed founders walk in with hope and leave stripped of their companies, their ideas stolen, their futures sold. Every time I watched a deal collapse, I reminded myself, that's what Daniel did to you. Learn. Adapt. And I did. But my real education came not from offices, but from libraries and shadows. I spent nights surrounded by stacks of books, hostile takeover case studies, forensic accounting manuals, corporate law loopholes. I read about men like Carl Icahn and Gordon Gekko, the real wolves who taught Wall Street how to devour. I studied scandals like Enron, collapses like Lehman Brothers, market crashes engineered by greed. I wasn't horrified. I was fascinated. These weren't cautionary tales, they were roadmaps. The deeper I went, the colder I became. I stopped thinking like a victim and started thinking like a predator. I no longer asked, why did Daniel betray me? I asked, how did he do it, and how can I do it better? Michael became my digital ghost. He wasn't just a brother, he was my hacker, my watchtower. He taught me how to trace shell companies, how to follow money across borders, how to weaponize information. Finance is war, he told me once over an encrypted call. But wars are won with intelligence, not brute force. Slowly, I started building something of my own. Using my father's seed money, I invested quietly, first in small real estate projects, then in tech startups others dismissed as risky. I kept everything under aliases, shell corporations, offshore accounts. My name, Emma Carter, remained invisible. By the time I turned 30, I had multiplied my father's gift tenfold. But this wasn't about wealth. It was about leverage. And while I was sharpening my claws, Daniel Blake was soaring. His company, Stonewell Capital, plastered his face across Forbes and CNBC. He was called the king of modern finance, celebrated at galas, photographed with politicians. Every article made my blood boil, but I forced myself to smile. Because with every rise comes arrogance. And arrogance leaves openings. It was during those years that I met the first of my silent allies, men and women who hated Daniel more than I did. There was Victor Huang, a hedge fund manager Daniel had undercut in a ruthless deal. There was Marissa Cole, a brilliant analyst he once fired and blacklisted because she outshined him. And there was Leonard Price, an aging banker who had lost millions trusting Daniel's charm. Each of them had scars. Each of them had rage. And I became the quiet voice that said, what if we didn't just hate him? What if we took him down? Still, I knew I wasn't ready. Revenge isn't a sprint, it's a marathon. I couldn't storm back into New York and declare war. I needed to become fluent in the language of sharks. So I kept swimming. I learned how to manipulate debt markets, how to stage proxy fights in corporate boards, how to bend media narratives with a single leak. I trained myself to keep my face unreadable, my voice steady, my presence forgettable. The more invisible I became, the more powerful I felt. There were nights I almost broke. Nights when loneliness hit harder than betrayal. Nights when I wanted to hear Daniel's voice just to scream at him. But every time I faltered, I remembered my father's words, never let them steal your name. And so, piece by piece, I rebuilt my name, not in the light, but in the shadows. By the time I returned to New York, I was no longer Emma Carter, the ruined fiancée. I was Carter Holdings, a faceless entity with silent capital, whispered connections, and claws hidden behind contracts. And though Daniel didn't know it yet, every step he took up the ladder was leading him closer to the blade I was sharpening. Because sharks don't just swim. They circle. They wait. And when they strike, they never miss. And I had become the sharpest shark of them all. They say revenge tastes best served cold. But they never tell you how long you need to freeze it. By the time I returned to New York, my vengeance had aged like fine wine, sharp, intoxicating, and ready to be poured. I stepped out of JFK Airport after nearly 6 years away. The skyline looked the same, but I wasn't. Gone was the naive girl who had once believed in love stories written in business plans. In her place was a strategist, cloaked in invisibility, armed with patience and power. I didn't return as Emma Carter, the woman Daniel had humiliated. That name was buried. I returned as the faceless architect behind Carter Holdings, a shell empire hidden beneath layers of proxies, offshore accounts, and silent partners. My name never appeared on paper. My face never appeared in meetings. But my money? My influence? It was everywhere. The first step in my return was small, almost laughable, acquiring tiny shares of Stonewell Capital, Daniel's empire. To him, it was nothing, a mosquito bite in the skin of his billion-dollar beast. To me, it was the first stitch in the noose I was tightening around his neck. But I knew better than to confront him directly. Giants don't fall from punches, they collapse from termites eating away their foundations. And I was about to unleash an army of termites. I sought out Daniel's enemies, one by one. Victor Huang, the hedge fund manager Daniel had publicly humiliated in a hostile deal, still carried that scar. When I met him in a dimly lit bar in Manhattan, he studied me with suspicion. "Why do you care about Blake?" he asked, swirling his drink. I smiled. "Because he stole from me too. And I don't plan on forgiving him." That was all it took. Hatred is a language fluent across all boardrooms. Then came Marissa Cole, the analyst Daniel had once crushed because she outshone him. She had been reduced to freelance consulting, her career nearly destroyed. When I offered her a place at Carter Holdings, she didn't hesitate. "Tell me the target," she said, fire in her eyes. Finally, Leonard Price, the banker Daniel had tricked into losing millions. He was older now, bitter, sipping whiskey alone in private clubs. But when I whispered, "I can give you Daniel Blake's head on a silver platter," his laugh echoed like a man reborn. These people weren't just allies. They were my pawns, my soldiers, my family in vengeance, but my real family never left my side. My father, Richard, was my anchor. He reviewed every contract, every strategy, reminding me not to let rage cloud reason. "Emma," he said one night, "this isn't about burning him down. It's about building yourself higher." My mother, Helen, though still afraid, had transformed her fear into quiet strength. She managed the human side of Carter Holdings, scholarships, community projects, ensuring our empire had a soul. And Michael, my brother, was my ghost in the machine. He hacked into Stonewell's servers, traced offshore accounts, leaked damaging reports to journalists under anonymous names. Every time Daniel boasted in the media, Michael whispered in my ear, "His numbers are inflated. He's bluffing." We weren't just family anymore. We were a syndicate. Months into my return, I began attending Stonewell Capital's shareholder meetings, not as Emma, but as a nameless representative of Carter Holdings. Daniel barely glanced at me. To him, I was just another suit, another forgettable investor. That invisibility was my weapon. I sat silently at the long glass tables, watching him perform. He still had that magnetic smile, that politician's charm. He dazzled the room, but I noticed the cracks. The impatience in his voice when questioned about debt. The way his eyes flickered at any mention of competition. He was still arrogant, still reckless, and arrogance breeds mistakes. Each meeting, I slipped small suggestions into the discussions. Subtle changes in direction, minor votes that seemed meaningless. He never noticed the hand guiding his company from the shadows. But slowly, piece by piece, Stonewell was bending, not to him, but to me. And the sweetest part? Sitting across from him, close enough to see the smug curve of his lips, knowing he had no idea I was the ghost of Emma Carter, the woman he thought he buried. But business isn't only fought in boardrooms. It's fought in headlines. Through carefully placed leaks, Carter Holdings began to reshape Daniel's image. Stories of Stonewell's questionable practices started appearing in financial journals. Analysts began whispering doubts. Investors started hesitating. Meanwhile, Carter Holdings was praised as the rising star of ethical finance. Scholarships for women in business, green investments, community projects, it was all part of the mask. Behind the mask was steel, but the world saw only benevolence. Every article that praised me was a dagger into Daniel's ego. Because no matter how loud his empire roared, a whisper against him carried more weight when the whisper was mine. One night, fate tested me. I was leaving a gala hosted by the Financial Times when I heard a familiar voice. Emma? I froze. It was Daniel. He stood a few feet away, tuxedo sharp, champagne in hand, shock flickering across his face. For a moment, the world shrank back to the day he betrayed me. I smiled, calm, controlled. I think you're mistaken, I said smoothly. My name is Evelyn Carter. Carter Holdings. He blinked, uncertain, but my confidence disarmed him. He chuckled awkwardly, muttered something about mistaken identity, and walked away. But as I watched him disappear into the crowd, I whispered to myself, you were right the first time. It was Emma. And I'm already inside your kingdom. By the end of my first year back, Carter Holdings owned 8% of Stonewall Capital. Not enough for control, but enough to have a seat at every table, enough to watch his every move. Daniel had no idea. To him, Carter Holdings was just another faceless investor, another check in his empire. But to me, Stonewall Capital was no longer his kingdom. It was my battlefield. And the more I watched him, the more I realized something terrifying. Daniel wasn't just reckless. He was vulnerable. His arrogance blinded him. His debts piled high. His enemies circled. All I had to do was push. The return wasn't about announcing myself. It wasn't about screaming, I'm back. It was about becoming the whisper he couldn't hear until it was too late. Because shadows don't need to roar. They just need to wait. And I was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The night I decided to take Daniel's crown, New York's skyline looked like a chessboard lit in gold. Each tower was a piece, each window a move. And at the very center, gleaming above the rest, was Stonewall Capital, the empire he built on my broken bones. Tonight, it would begin to collapse. Not with a gunshot, not with a scandalous betrayal in a dark alley, but with signatures, whispers, and numbers written on paper. I had spent years preparing for this night, weaving my invisible threads across Wall Street like a spider patient in her web. Piece by piece, I bought the loyalty of his shareholders. One wanted money, another wanted influence, another just wanted Daniel humiliated. Everyone has a price, and I paid them all. When I walked into the annual general meeting of Stonewall Capital, I was not Emma Carter, the woman who had once been discarded. I was Evelyn Carter, faceless yet feared, holding silent power that Daniel couldn't even sense around his throat. The boardroom was a temple of glass and arrogance. Daniel stood at the head of the table, dressed in a sharp navy suit, his voice booming with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. He didn't recognize me, not fully. Perhaps a flicker of doubt crossed his eyes when he saw me, but his ego dismissed it. To him, I was still nobody, another investor with a polite smile and silent eyes. He spoke about growth, about expansion, about his empire's inevitable dominance. The room nodded, hypnotized by his performance. I said nothing. I didn't need to. Because every nodding head, every polite smile around him, they weren't his anymore. They were mine. When the votes began, Daniel expected routine approval. He leaned back in his chair, smug, certain of his control. But as each hand raised, each decision tilted, I watched his expression crack. Motions he assumed would pass in his favor instead swayed against him. Projects he demanded were suddenly delayed. His control slipped like sand through clenched fists. And then came the dagger, hidden beneath corporate formality, the proposal for new leadership. Daniel laughed, a sharp, arrogant sound, dismissing it as a joke. You want to replace me? In my company? He sneered at the room, at me. This is my empire. My name built it. My vision drives it. None of you exist without me. And then the votes were cast. One by one, the people he trusted betrayed him, not with knives, but with ballots. When the final count was read, his empire no longer belonged to him. It belonged to Carter Holdings. It belonged to me. Silence fell. Daniel's face drained of color, rage flickering in his eyes like a man watching his house burn while holding a bucket of water too small to save it. He slammed his fist against the table, but it was useless. His voice no longer carried weight here. The throne had been stolen, not by force, but by strategy, by patience, by a woman he had once underestimated. I rose from my chair slowly, deliberately, and the room's attention turned toward me. For the first time, I let the mask slip. For the first time, he heard the voice he had once silenced. "Empires don't fall with swords, Daniel," I said softly, yet every ear heard me, every heart pounded with the weight of it. "They fall when their kings forget who built them." Tonight, you remembered. Recognition flashed across his face. His lips parted, his voice cracked as he whispered my name. Emma. The sound of it was music. For years he thought I was buried under his betrayal, forgotten, erased. But now, here I stood, not as his victim, but as his conqueror. He tried to rise, to speak, to claw back his power with words, but the boardroom wasn't his kingdom anymore. It was mine. The allies I had gathered, the enemies he had made, they all stood united under the banner of Carter Holdings. He stormed toward me, his fury naked, but guards stepped in. Not mine. The company's own security. That was the final humiliation. His empire's protectors now shielded me, not him. He was escorted out, thrashing, cursing, swearing vengeance he could never deliver. Because vengeance belongs to those who are patient enough to wait, and Daniel had never known patience. When the doors closed behind him, I sat in the chair he once owned. The room applauded, though I hardly heard it. My heart was pounding, not with fear, but with victory. This wasn't the end, not yet. Daniel would try to claw back, to smear, to threaten. But I wasn't afraid. I had stripped him of his empire without lifting a weapon. I had broken the king without drawing a sword. That night, as I stood by the glass wall overlooking the city, I thought of my family. My father's steady wisdom, my mother's quiet strength, my brother's silent loyalty, all of it had carried me here. I thought of the nights of hunger, of fear, of betrayal. I thought of the girl who had once believed in Daniel's promises. She was gone. What remained was Emma Carter reborn, Evelyn Carter crowned. And as the city glittered beneath me, I knew this wasn't just revenge. This was justice, carved into the skyline of New York, etched into the fall of Daniel Blake. And somewhere in the distance, I imagined him alone, stripped of power, screaming at a world that no longer listened. His empire was mine. His crown was mine. And soon, his very name would be nothing more than a footnote in the story of the woman he tried to destroy. I didn't need to kill him. I didn't need to ruin him with scandal or blood. I had done something far crueler. I had left him alive, forced to watch me sit on the throne he built, forced to breathe in a world where every breath reminded him of his failure. That was my sword. That was my revenge. And the taste of it was sweeter than anything I had ever imagined. They say revenge ends when the enemy is destroyed, but that's a lie. True revenge ends when the enemy watches you rise higher than they ever dreamed and realizes they were powerless to stop it. That was my legacy, not just tearing Daniel Blake down, but building something eternal on the ashes of his empire. The morning after the takeover, headlines across New York screamed of Stonewall Capital's collapse and Carter Holdings' rise. Photographers swarmed the streets, journalists begged for statements, and television anchors tried to make sense of it all. A mysterious investor, they called me at first. The faceless queen of finance, some whispered. But eventually, I let them see me. Not Evelyn Carter. Not the ghost. I stepped into the cameras as Emma Carter, the woman Daniel had betrayed, the woman the world thought broken. The shock was seismic. The betrayal he had tried to bury was now public record. The world saw the story not as a financial coup but as a saga of betrayal, resilience, and vengeance. They turned me into a symbol. Women in boardrooms whispered my name like a legend. Journalists wrote about me as the phoenix rising from the ashes. Students studied Carter Holdings as a case in strategy. My name no longer carried shame. It carried power. But the legacy wasn't mine alone. My family stood beside me in every headline, every boardroom, every victory lap. My father Richard, once worried I was blinded by revenge, now walked the corridors of Carter Holdings with pride. "You've done what I never could, Emma," he told me, his voice heavy with emotion. "You built not just a company, but a dynasty." My mother Helen, once trembling at the thought of Daniel's shadow, now commanded charity boards, her voice steady, her eyes no longer afraid. And Michael, my brother, became the invisible guardian of our empire, the ghost in every machine, ensuring no one could ever touch us the way Daniel had. We weren't just survivors anymore. We were architects of something greater. And Daniel? Daniel became a ghost of his own making. The mighty king reduced to a man begging for scraps. His name disappeared from headlines except in disgrace. His former allies abandoned him, his friends vanished, his fortune withered. Rumors spread of him drinking alone in dimly lit bars, swearing that he would rise again. But every time he tried, every time he reached for a deal or a connection, he found Carter Holdings already there, blocking his path. He wasn't just defeated, he was erased. His legacy didn't end with fire or glory. It ended with silence, with the world forgetting he ever mattered. There was a night, months later, when I saw him again. It wasn't in a boardroom or a courtroom, but in a small, failing cafe downtown. He sat alone at a corner table, hunched over, his suit wrinkled, his hands shaking as he nursed a cheap drink. He didn't notice me, or maybe he did but couldn't bear to look. For a moment, I almost felt pity. Almost. But then I remembered the girl I once was, the girl he humiliated, the family he almost destroyed, the dreams he crushed, and pity turned to steel. I left without a word. That was his punishment, to live in a world where I thrived and he withered, to breathe in a city that now belonged to me. But my story wasn't just about him anymore. It was about legacy. Carter Holdings became more than a company, it became a movement. We invested in women-led startups, rebuilt communities Daniel had once exploited, and created opportunities for people who had been overlooked. Every building we raised, every program we funded, every scholarship we granted was a reminder. Empires built on betrayal collapse, but empires built on resilience endure. Years later, as I stood at the top of our headquarters, overlooking the same skyline that had once mocked me, I thought about the girl who had landed in New York with nothing but love and hope in her heart. She died the night Daniel betrayed her. But from her ashes rose someone stronger, someone who understood that pain can either bury you or sharpen you into a blade. I chose the blade. And as I spoke to the camera for one final interview, I left the world with words that would outlive me. Subscribe to your own survival. Subscribe to your own power. Don't let anyone else write your story. I was betrayed, I was broken, but I built again. And now, I am the empire. The world cheered. The cameras flashed. And somewhere, in some forgotten corner of the city, Daniel Blake heard my voice and knew the truth. He hadn't just lost a company. He hadn't just lost his crown. He had lost the war to a woman he thought would never fight back. That was my legacy. That was my empire. From ashes, I had built a kingdom. And from betrayal, I had carved immortality. Emma Carter's story didn't end with revenge. It ended with dominance. And dominance never dies.